So there was a study done this week by Asmodee, or at least funded by Asmodee. I don't know who conducted the study. And it was a market research on board games in the UK, the US, France, and Sweden. And it had a sample size of about 8,000 members. And I'll get to that little bit at the end of the video because it's kind of relevant to the article that I read, which kind of annoyed me, which prompted me to make this video in the first place. So they polled 8,000 people and found 25% of them played at least one tabletop game a week, and that 64% of people responded that it was a way of bringing their family together and socializing and, a bit of escapism from overwhelming world events or whatever. And now, this I find credible, if, not necessarily the percentages. I don't know what the percentages are, but I find it credible that lots of people play games at least once a week, and that most people at some point will play some sort of game to, get together with their family, to socialize, and to just, turn your mind off from whatever's happening in the outside world. That's what most entertainment is for, is to, be entertained and not worrying about, whatever your current situation is, whatever the situation in the world is. So that part I find credible. The 25% of people that play games at least once a week, because the study was done in Sweden and France and the UK, I think that skews higher than what the numbers would be in North America, because North America does have a pretty good gaming culture, and obviously most games find success by, having a way to sell in North America, because North America is a huge marketplace. But that doesn't necessarily mean that, 25% of people in North America are playing board games once a week. It just means that there's a very large market in North America of consumers who are willing to spend lots of money because there's a lot of wealth in North America. So I don't know whether, if this study was done just in the US, whether that 25% would hold up, whether it would be lower. I guess it's possible it would be higher. But let's assume for a minute that 25% of people play board games once a week, or tabletop games of some kind once a week. I mean, they're pretty great. They're awesome. They have lots of variety. And I'm thinking of doing a series of, just pulling out a game and explaining it, do a video for each game that I happen to have on the shelf. But I mean, you have this wide variety of things, from, you know, putting dice together and upgrading them as you go along, or having a deck building game, or, exploring a forest, or, setting up colonies in Puerto Rico, or uh, fighting with He-Man, or simulating one of the best chess matches ever, but not actually playing chess. It's just a huge variety, and I can go on. We got collecting bugs, to rolling dice about ghosts, to making beer and bread. It goes on and on. There doesn't seem to be an end to the themes that are available in board games. So it's not surprising that maybe now more than ever people are interested in board games, because once they find out that they can get a board game that's catered to their interests, or they can get really close to that more so than they could before, they just become lifelong adherents, at least to that board game, if not others that have a similar feel to them. And it's not just the themes themselves; it's the vibes that the game gives off, or the types of mechanics that are used. So a lot of people aren't interested in something like Axis and Allies, where you conquer, different territories, or Risk, or something like that, where you're rolling lots of dice, conquering lots of territories. But there's games that are nowhere even near that, that are mostly, worker placement, or collecting things, or things similar to the old card games like Rummy and stuff like that, but in a board game form. That's sort of like how I view, Wingspan, right? Or I guess up here you've got Azul. So these kinds of things make me think of what when you were young and you were playing with your parents, or your aunts and uncles and stuff like that, and you're playing rummy or some other sort of set collecting card game, and the board games are just iterative of that, or like I said, worker placement, or territorial control, territorial conquering. um, there's role-playing games, there's miniature war games, there's collectible card games, and there's all kinds of different things and different mechanics and different complexity levels to different games, so that there's just a wide variety to choose from. So people discover, once they discover a game store and come in and see the variety, and if you have a game store owner or employees that are knowledgeable about what the board games are, and they can sort of extract from the customer coming in what their interests are, they can be paired up and they can find that they are interested in quite a few board games. And that is, I think, what's really driving this, I guess, resurgence of board games. Now, Europe has had a long board gaming tradition, a much more in-depth board gaming tradition than North America, and that's in the Euro versus Ameritrash board game debate. But it's mostly that there's lots of other forms of entertainment that North Americans focused on for longer and more often than board games themselves. So basically, North America might now be moving towards the sort of zeitgeist that Europe was in the 90s and early 2000s. From what I understand, just more people in Europe were likely to play board games than people in North America. Now, the gripe that I had with the article that I read was that the the sample size of 8,000 needs to be taken with a grain of salt, because it's a very low sample size, and I don't know what this person's background is. I mean, it might just be someone who just writes articles for a board game magazine that has never looked at studies or anything, because as far as I know, I used to work in market research, political market research mostly, some commercial market research, and I can tell you that the sample sizes are mostly under 1,000, and depending on what it is, sometimes it goes over 1,000. Like, for instance, one of the market research firms that I worked for used to do and may still do it, the studies, or I guess surveys with students in colleges after they've gotten their college degree, and to find out whether they're working and whether they're working in the field that they were working in. Now, those would have several thousand surveys completed sometimes, depending on the year and the quarter or whatever, because the colleges in Ontario require their funding was partially based on the outcomes of these surveys, right? Because the Ontario government wanted to make sure that when people go to college, they're getting gainfully employed and they're getting something out of the money that they spend at college. But those were sort of compelled surveys, meaning that people were continually called as much as possible to do these surveys, and it was stressed that it was, I don't know if it was a requirement of their degree or whether it was just a government requirement to get a 98 percentile of respondents of the graduates of that year. But those it just meant that the sample size was much larger, because it was more dedicated and focused on getting all the respondents to respond, whether or not it was compelled or whether it was based on just continually calling until we got the answers that we needed. So that was well over 1,000 most years, I believe, or at least every quarter was somewhere around 1,000 to 2,000. I can't remember exactly, but I'm saying that's a much larger sample size. But when I was doing, say, I remember surveys for OnStar at another market research firm. So anytime someone pressed the OnStar button on a car, that would prompt a survey, but not all the surveys were basically sent out to the call center to make those surveys. you would usually go in a bunch of folders and just randomly select a bunch and throw them onto the auto dialer, and then however many surveys we got is what we got for that night. And the sample size for that was for some vehicles less than 100. Some other vehicles, the sample size was over 500, but it just really depended on how many people had in North America had pressed the OnStar button that week or that month or whatever, that quarter. But again, the information that the company was trying to get from that was how to improve the OnStar customer interface and that kind of stuff, and not to the degree of, say, colleges that need to get funding from the government based on whether people got meaningful employment, right? So the sample size can be determined by the importance of the the study, right? And is board gaming studies that important? I think you could get a lot of answers from a sample size of under 500. And this is why when you look at surveys, they say an error, what was it, an error rate of 2%. Usually that's where you want to be at. And so it could, like, if something says 53% of people say whatever, then it could be 51% or it could be 55%. And there's a lot of math that goes into figuring out that margin of error. And a sample size of 1,000 is usually considered quite good. So 8,000 is pretty huge. Now, combining 4 different cultures, however, they're all Western cultures, into one study probably gives less meaningful information because, again, North Americans and Britons and Swedes and the French are very different, right? They have very different outlooks. However, you could say there's more in common between the French and Swedes. There's more in common between the French and the Britons, and there's more in common between the Britons and the North Americans, right? But to jump from North America to Sweden is several hops in differences in culture, right? So that article kind of poo-poos the 8,000 people that were polled, but 8,000 is a very large number, and I think a very good sample size, and therefore the margin error should be quite low, especially because it's the information being gathered isn't really that important. And one of the, as an example, what level of importance you put on the questions that you ask a surveyor, or what the content is about, that can change how people answer things. People might outright refuse to answer very personal things or very highly dangerous political things, or other things. They might decide not to answer questions, or they might not answer questions truthfully, or they may not be give the full truth in their answers. But for something as low level of importance like board games, people are going to be more open and honest in a survey. So therefore, you could probably trust the results more. Now, also, maybe the people conducting the study, I don't know whether it was via phone or via, I don't know, surveys online or whatever, but their natural relaxation can either help or hurt the results of the survey, depending on how they're trained, who's managing them. But we don't know that. You have to assume that that everyone conducting a study puts in their best efforts, and you can't really take a study as gospel. You got to kind of wait for a meta study. So we're going to have a whole lot more studies about tabletop games before we can find out really how many people are involved in tabletop games. But I can tell you that I think there was a peak back, maybe as far back as 2016, and maybe 2019 to 2020 was the end of the peak, and then things started to maybe stabilize or go down a little, because I don't think that board games are necessarily in a market upswing. I think that they are in a holding pattern at best. Things like Warhammer are doing great, but they've always kind of done great. Warhammer is very steady, but board games itself, it seems like there's less overall interest in new board games than there was 5, 10 years ago, right? I think that the hype has died down a little bit. Same thing with tabletop role playing games. The hype has been on an upswing with collectible card games, especially Pokemon and Magic. So, if it also depends on what this study is asking about and what the respondent thinks in their head when they think of board games, right? Do obviously these are board games, those are war games. There's collectible card games, but some people consider it all the same thing, right? Especially people that are only casually in the hobby. So when they're playing Magic the Gathering, they know they're playing a card game, but if someone asks them on the phone, did you play a board game last week? They're going to say yes, but they only played Magic the Gathering, right? Now, if the survey is done really well, meaning there's lots of qualifying questions beforehand to get people in the mindset of what is a board game, what isn't a board game, and whether it's clearly defined, then the sample is better, the answers to the questions are better, and the data is more reliable. So I guess I have to look at the survey to see what it entailed. But I haven't worked in market research in a long time, and I didn't particularly find it fun enough that I would bother going through that kind of stuff. I'm just talking generally about this idea of a study about board games, and they should do more, and we should find out where the culture's at, and they should find out the types of board games people want, the things that excite people about board games, and I guess find ways to improve the customer experience with tabletop games and give them what they want, because you give them what they want, then there's more sales, and then there's more people in the hobby, and more of us can play with each other online, in person, whatever. Anyway, let me know what you think in the comments below. Have a good day.